All right. Good evening, everybody. Welcome in. Welcome in. This is our weekly Come Follow Me, where we are going through the Old Testament and we are in the book of Judges. And I have with me Jessica of Christ Pearls, and I have LD Scooby. And we are here. We are going to talk about um, the book of Judges and a lot of good information. Jessica's always bringing some really good, interesting spins on this. Hey, Kiora, welcome to that. I am streaming to Facebook, to X, to TikTok, and YouTube. And so, yeah, let's go ahead and just get started. Let's get
Dive
into
in.
it.
So should I do just maybe like read the bullet points, like the overview first, and then do you guys care if I skip over to chapters 4 and 5 and then
Whatever you want,
Yeah,
man.
okay.
yeah, sure.
And then we'll go back and do the whole thing. So I found some really cool stuff that is carrying over a theme that we've been talking about like pretty much every week, from the time that we covered Genesis. It was like the Joseph in Egypt, like 37 through 50. And it just keeps coming up, but it's the scarlet thread motif. And when I saw it in this story, I got excited because I was just like, wow, this is like actually a thing. And I think this is like a thread that I am interested in pulling on. So, just for an overview on Judges, I made like a little bullet list, including the chapters that we skipped. There were some cool stories in there we're not going to cover because they're not part of the lesson, but I did make a quick summary. So Judges chapter 1 is after Joshua's death. This is the tribe's attempt to continue conquering Canaan, but they failed to fully drive out all of the inhabitants, which is what they were told to do. And they start allowing Canaanite influence and idolatry to remain in the land. And then Judges 2, an angel of the Lord rebukes Israel for breaking covenant and tolerating pagan worship. The book introduces this recurring cycle of sin, oppression, repentance, and deliverance through Judges, which is something we'll talk about. And then chapter 3, the Lord leaves surrounding nations to test Israel. And then Othniel delivers Israel from Mesopotamian oppression. Ehud assassinates the Moabite king Eglon, and Shamgar defeats Philistines with an ox goad in chapter 3. So that's kind of, there's a lot of still drama happening here. Now, 4 and 5 of Judges is something that I'd like to focus on. So this is what we're going to turn to next. But I really loved this because I found that scarlet thread there. This is something that's unique to the prophetess Deborah and to just Judges in general, this section.
So, for those who are coming in, if they weren't here for last week, can you just briefly describe the scarlet thread that you've discovered?
Yeah. So let me pull up a slide. Can I pull up a slide from last week that will kind of summarize it? Let me go to, let's see, where is our one from last week? It was that Deuteronomy combination one. So let me go to that. And I had made a slide that pulled in some threads, like a little section of slides. So let me share that really quick. That is this one. Okay, so I made this little section of slides. Do you guys remember this? It was the scarlet thread.
Mhm.
And we talked about this last week, where basically the idea is that that story of Tamar in Genesis 38, this technically you could go back to Rebecca with Esau and Jacob, because remember when Esau was born, they noted that he had this red hair and like the hairy coat. Remember the hairy red coat thing? And I think it
Right.
actually kind of started right there, this concept of like scarlet. But where you really see it, I think, become the scarlet thread is in this part of Genesis 38:28. And if you just read from verse 28 down to the end of the chapter, it's like a few verses, you'll see what I mean. But it's that story where Tamar, remember how she had to scheme to be able to have a covenant fulfilled, like a law fulfilled for herself to be able to bear children to her dead husband's name. Judah was blocking her from being able to do this.
Mhm.
It was really a form of oppression. She overcomes it by disguising herself as a harlot. And she ends up having these two twins, one of which preserves the messianic line of Judah, which is very important to those blessings that were given by Jacob Israel to his posterity, particularly Joseph of Egypt. Then you saw that again in Rahab, which we just talked about in the Joshua sections. And I noticed that they're bringing that scarlet like thread motif forward by the she hangs the scarlet like scarf from the window, and then it kind of harkened back to Moses with the blood of the lamb for the Passover on the door frames. And so there's this idea of the deliverance and the deliverer who is Jesus Christ coming, and this scarlet thread is the thread of the women preserving the covenant line of Jesus Christ for this Messiah to come. What's the purpose of this? Well, the purpose is to save all of God's children and bring them back into his presence. Without this savior, the plan is frustrated. And so you see these women making these incredible sacrifices and putting themselves in positions where they could literally be killed just to preserve this covenant line that's prophesied for the Messiah to come through. And then you will see this again in Ruth later. We'll talk about that. But this is all pointing towards Jesus Christ, but it's the women's story. It's like, well, what do these women do to ensure this posterity remains intact? And so here's another example. We can look back at the midwives. Remember, we talked about Shiphrah and Puah. And we talked about also Miriam and her mother Jochebed, how they preserved Moses' life. He was a prophesied deliverer, and he played a huge role in restoring after 400 years of Israel's captivity, right? So there's all these like women who are like trying to fulfill these covenant promises as best they can in a world that's so fallen and is standing in opposition to everything that they're trying to do. And so we're kind of looking at that. And again, this is kind of pointing up to Mary, who is kind of like our ultimate representation of when these prophecies will start to be fulfilled, pointing to Jesus Christ. And then, so anyway, I just kind of went through, you can kind of see this. It's like a token at the threshold. It symbolizes the household gathering. There's always these themes in these Scarlet Thread stories. So this is kind of like this Passover theme that keeps coming through. And then I wanted to pull this in. At some point, I want to talk about this. It's going to come up in the future because there's going to be other places where this will come forward. But I'm going to put together a presentation on just this concept of weaving because this is strictly a feminine motif. There's literally nothing masculine about this. And so I want to point it out because it will play into this idea of the scarlet thread. And then this is kind of like going back to the Garden of Eden. And it's pointing to Jesus Christ as the ultimate savior. There were some other stories that it linked to. And what I really liked about this was that you can think of the coats of light that were given in Eden, the blood that's been shed. Here's that red coat in Genesis from Esau when he was born. Then you have the Tamar story where that it's literally called the scarlet thread. And then you end up with this interesting like blue thread that comes into play in Numbers 15. And when you mix blue and red, you get purple. And there's actually a place where this is discussed in Exodus. And I want to say it's like Exodus 25, maybe. I might have it still here.
Well, isn't purple representative of royalty as well? So
it is Exodus 35.
That goes along with what you're saying about the women preserving the line of Jesus Christ faithfully.
Exactly. It's preserving the royal lineage that becomes King David's lineage. And so in Exodus 35, there's this really interesting idea that's happening with the blue and the purple. And it says, all the women who were wise of heart spun with their hands and brought what they had spun, the blue, the purple, the scarlet yarn, and the fine linen, which is what this slide is representing. So anyways, I probably need to put some speaker notes on this so I can get all this stuff straight, but I'll try to pull this slide again forward.
Really quick on that, like the way that you just phrased that makes me think a lot about the Book of Mormon, how when people began this cycle of, being faithful and then the pride and then they fall and whatnot, one of the main things that gets referenced is, and they began to wear exceedingly fine clothing. And to me, what that is talking a little bit more is kind of like how the Pharisees and the Sadducees became so fixated on the physical or material aspect of the law that they lost the spiritual aspects of it, and that ultimately leads them to apostasy. So the material here is being used in a very symbolic and spiritual way, but if you get too caught up in what the thread, like if you look beyond the metaphor and you're like, oh, look at these fine linens and we're wearing, then you actually separate yourself from the whole purpose of it. Anyways, that's just the way that you phrased that was like, oh, hey,
Mhm.
Well,
that
yeah,
always gets
because
brought up.
you can see two different it's like the opposites, right? Because there's always like the righteous and then the unrighteous kind of usage, or the, the two paths idea. It's in all of this. Everything has this like dual symbolism. And one of the things that I really like about this scarlet thread motif, you guys, is if you do this through the scriptures, which I've been doing, this is my take on it, okay? This is just the gospel through my lens, okay? But I am seeing a specific role that only women can do. And it goes back to that idea in Eden of the Ezer Kenendo, which is this concept that there is no salvation for Adam or humanity without this role that Eve will play. And she acts as an intercessor, and she always intercedes for the purpose of bringing the covenant that we started premortally with Jesus Christ into being, like into existence. Sorry, my son is like yelling. I don't know if anyone can hear that. He's like throwing a fit. But like,
You're
anyways,
good.
so think of the scarlet thread this way. Think of
Mhm.
it how it goes back to those linens in Eden, the coat that's given, the coats of light, the skins of light, whatever, however you want to call it, coats of skins of
So
light, coats of light. And then how it goes back to this idea of the covenant. And so there's a role that women are playing here, you guys, and it's choosing the birthright son is part of this. They're
mhm,
the ones who mark them with the scarlet thread to the firstborn. But remember, in the story of Rebecca with Esau and Jacob, even though Esau was the firstborn and he did receive this code or had the marking that he was the firstborn, she changes it. And I feel like there's a concept here that's really important to this thread, where there's something that she has in terms of her, I don't know what you want to call it. I would call it priesthood, just because the prophet and the apostles haven't called it
mhm,
priestesshood, but you could call it whatever you want. But I would say it's the authority or the special calling. What if you get offended
right.
by the idea of a woman having authority, think of it as her gift, like whatever floats your little boat. Just understand that there is something that only she can do. And that's the
Right.
concept of the scarlet thread. So,
So I have a question because I just thought of this. So in the scripture, I can't remember exactly where it's at. I think it's in Isaiah. It talks about how though your sins be as scarlet,
mhm, yeah.
they shall
And
be as white as snow.
yes, and this actually ties
And
to another thing
that's
that's
what I'm
coming up
wondering is
later.
if this is tiding right into that this is referring to the scarlet thread.
No, it does. All of the mentions of this word scarlet will tie into this. And so
Okay.
there's basically if you follow this phrase all the way through, you'll see what I
Mhm,
mean. And it always is pointing to the savior, but in association with this concept of the
mhm,
thread that's being weaved has to do with lineage, posterity, and a priestly kingdom.
mhm,
Okay, so those are the ideas there, and I think that's what these three threads are representing. So there's the blue and the white and the
mhm,
red, and I know this is very esoteric, and there's probably a lot of other ways you can look at it. It's just this is one way that as I'm studying this, like, I keep feeling the spirit in what I'm reading, and I'm just kind of blown away by
mhm,
some of the insights that I feel like I'm receiving, and it's helping me, particularly at this time in my life where I'm going through something really hard that I think has to do with like my motherhood
mhm.
role. So I think that's probably why I'm seeing it. But that said, I just wanted to um I don't know, just kind of feature this a little bit. So let me go back over to the other slides that we have here. Okay.
So while you're doing that really quick, just so this analogy of the weaver and specifically the book of Judges, because we see a very
Mhm,
clear pattern of people being called to do something, they aren't necessarily faithful in that, and it could have been better, kind of a thing. Um, my favorite poem of all time, I've never been able to find an author to it, but it goes like this: My life is but a weaving between my God and me. I do not choose the colors he worketh steadily. Oft times he with sorrow, and I in foolish pride forgets he sees the upper, and I the underside. Not till the loom is silent and the shuttle cease to fly does he unveil the canvas and reveal the reason why. The dark threads are as needful in the skillful weaver's hand as the threads of gold and silver in the pattern he has planned. And
That's beautiful.
I haven't been able to find who the author is of that. I've seen a couple of mixed things, but when I think of like Samson, for example, even though that's not directly the story of Deborah, it's like if he had just stayed faithful to the covenants he had made, what could have been, kind of a thing, kind of an idea. And I think that also has to do a lot with these other individuals that we've been mentioning of the Lord has this wonderful promise for you, and he's being very, very patient, but ultimately he respects your agency. And you have to freely choose him to receive everything that he has promised. He's not just going to give you something you can't handle, kind of a thing.
Well, and I think that's true. And I think what we're doing is we're seeing these women who, because notice there is a theme, there's a trend that's happening where there are men who aren't really keeping covenant, or they're not living up to their priesthood privileges, as President Nelson might have said. And then you see that there's a woman who is an intercessor. And it's the intercessory role that seems to be tied with this. And so in Judges chapter 4, Deborah, prophetess and judge, summons Barak to battle against Sisera and King Jabin. The Lord defeats the Canaanites, and Jael kills Sisera with a tent peg. It's very gruesome, but I have some positivity to bring to this.
The first stake president, baby.
Good one. Yeah. The Song of Deborah poetically celebrates this victory, portraying Jehovah as the divine warrior who commands stars, storms, and rivers in defense of Israel. And that's what we see happening in this. Now, I'll just go through all the bullet points of the chapters really quick, and then I want to go over to Judges chapter 4. So in chapter 6,
real quick, I can I share this real quick? Because thinking about this, I just got. Have you ever had the experience where when the Holy Spirit just comes over you, you get the Holy Spirit chills? Like all of a sudden, your body starts firing on all cylinders. You know what this actually reminds me of is when you look at Lehi's vision of the tree of life.
I think it does.
The straight and narrow path, the rod of iron, the tree of life, and then you go to Nephi's vision, and then he understands that the tree of life is the mother of God, the vision of Mary.
It does. I think that it all does. I agree.
The thread is that rod of iron, but it's the thread that connects us to the tree of life.
I mean, I think you can look at it so many different ways because it's so the nature of this type of analysis, it really it all points back to Jesus Christ. Like, think of him at the center of everything. It's like it all connects to him, and he's like the crux of the plan, right? Because there is no plan without him. There was never you guys could come to earth, and if you sin, you're, you got a savior, he's plan B. It was always the savior, he's plan A. Like, there's no other way. And so I think that it does connect that way. So in Judges 6, we have Israel suffering under this Midianite oppression. You've got Gideon. He's called by the angel of the Lord. He's kind of
that's my favorite story is Gideon, the story of Gideon.
We'll let you talk about him. He's kind of like a mixed figure. He's quite the character. And then he destroys his father's altar to Baal, and he receives signs confirming his divine commission. Gideon's army in chapter 7 gets reduced to 300 men, so the glory will belong to God alone. Using trumpets, lamps, and pitchers, Israel miraculously defeats Midian. Gideon pursues the Midianite kings in chapter 8 and secures victory, but later fashions a golden ephod that becomes a spiritual snare and source of idolatry. And then in 9, you have Abimelech, Gideon's son, who murders his brothers and declares himself king. His violent reign collapses in civil conflict, ending with his death by a millstone dropped by a woman. So I love that one too. We've got the stake through the It's like hell hath no fury, guys. Be careful. And then in chapter 10, you have these minor judges, Tola and Jair. leading
Mhm.
Israel. The people fall into idolatry again. The Lord allows oppression from the Ammonites and the Philistines before Israel repents. In 11, you have Jephthah, an outcast warrior, is chosen to fight Ammon. He makes a tragic vow before the battle, leading to sacrifice or dedication of his daughter after victory. Jephthah defeats Ephraim in civil conflict in chapter 12. He's using what's called shibboleth. It's a test to identify the enemies. And there's minor judges, Ibzan, Elon, and Abdon, who follow. Then in 13, you've got the angel of the Lord who announces this miraculous birth of Samson to a barren woman. So we've got that woman theme kind of continuing, the barren woman theme continuing, where she ends up with this posterity, even though she's barren. Samson is consecrated as a Nazarite to begin delivering Israel from the Philistines. In chapter 14, Samson seeks a Philistine wife, kills a lion, gives a riddle at his wedding feast. Betrayal and revenge escalate tensions with the Philistines. Then in 15, Samson burns Philistine fields, defeats enemies with the jawbone of a donkey. This is a pretty exciting story.
More based Old Testament deaths.
I know,
Very
so
exotic.
dramatic. So dramatic. And then in 16, Samson, he gets betrayed by Delilah. And a lot of people probably know that story. After revealing the secret of his Nazarite covenant, blinded and imprisoned, he finally destroys the temple of Dagon, killing himself and many Philistines. And then in 17, a man named Micah creates a private idol shrine with a Levite priest, illustrating the growing religious corruption in Israel. The tribe of Dan steals Micah's idols in chapter 18 and priest, and conquers Laish and establishes an idolatrous religion center in the north. And then in Judges 19, a Levite's concubine is abused and killed in Gibeah, and Benjamin in a horrific episode paralleling Sodom and Gomorrah, exposing Israel's moral collapse. And then in Judges 20, the tribes unite in civil war against Benjamin after the crime at Gibeah. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Is it Gibeah? Massive bloodshed nearly destroys the tribe of Benjamin. And then Israel mourns in chapter 21 Benjamin's near extinction and devises controversial solutions to preserve that tribe. The book closes with the sobering statement: in those days, there was no king in Israel. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes. And so anyway, it's just a really interesting story that we have going on here in Judges. And yeah.
So
I'm going to go
I've
over to...
always wondered this. Because you have Samson, who was a Nazarene, who made a Nazarene covenant. Now, we know Jesus is from the tribe of Judah, but he also came from the town of Nazareth. Now, is the town of Nazareth where Samson himself came from? And
no,
could it possibly be that the covenant that, the I don't know what I'm saying.
Well, why don't you research that while we research that?
So this is actually a very common misconception. So Samson was what's called a Nazarite, not a Nazarene.
Okay, so he was a Nazarite. Okay.
Yeah, so he was a Nazarite, and it's fairly different. Whereas a Nazarene is just somebody who's from Nazareth. But there's a lot of speculation that Jesus himself was a Nazarite. But it's kind of one of those, like, there's not a whole lot of information to go off of. It takes a lot of verses out of their context and them saying, well, this makes sense because a Nazarite would do X, Y, and Z. And it's like, it needs to, it's not as explicit. I think people are connecting some dots there that may not be true, but it could be. Who knows?
Well, like I said, I've always wondered that.
I would say spend some time on that one. Yeah. So going over to Judges 4 and 5, Deborah stands out in the book of Judges as this really unique combination of prophetess, judge, covenant protector, and she's called mother in Israel. And there's only like 2 women who are called that. And I believe the other one was Miriam. I think it was, I can't even remember, but there's only 2 times where someone gets called that. She's one of the 2. And anyway, exercising her spiritual authority during one of these really dark periods in Israelite history where they have a lot of idolatry and apostasy happening and they're getting really fragmented, she comes to the rescue. And unlike many of the other judges, and this is interesting that she is a judge, Deborah's leadership is centered not only on military deliverance, but also on revelation, which she has. And there's a prophecy that she gives that gets fulfilled. She has wisdom in her judgment, and she exercises like a righteous judgment as she's guiding the people who are beneath her palm tree in Ephraim, in the land of Ephraim. And her faith and prophetic conviction inspired Barak and the armies of Israel to confront overwhelming Canaanite power, trusting that the Lord himself had gone out before them into battle. And then we have the Song of Deborah that preserves this victory in some of the oldest and most sophisticated poetry in Scripture, portraying Jehovah as the true divine warrior who commands storms, stars, rivers, and nations. Her title, Mother in Israel, reflects a broader covenant role of spiritual preservation and nurturing, illustrating how God can raise women with revelatory gifts and moral courage to strengthen and protect his people in times of crisis. And that's kind of the main trait that you'll see in all of these characters that are tied to this scarlet thread.
So with Deborah, is she like a typology of the divine feminine?
Well, I think that you have to look at all of them combined.
Right.
Like, I would say that if you really wanted to understand that, you would need a composite of all of these, because I think there's not, just like with all the prophets, there's not like any one perfect person other than Jesus, right? Well, for the feminine archetype, it's really difficult because, I mean, you can look at Christ for your character, traits that you want to develop, but there's some things that maybe are a little difficult to think of with in connection with him as a woman. And there's a lot that are like, he compares himself oftentimes to a woman, like a mother hen gathering her chickens. There's things that he does do that kind of help you. But I think that there's all these women here that can help us understand the things that God has inspired women of the past to do. And I would say that I am seeing a heavenly mother or like divine feminine motif happening with these threads. And the reason why is it goes back to the weaving, because there's, first of all, it's strictly a feminine trait. Like it's always women doing the weaving. It's always in a tabernacle temple context. And the only other context that you see it is in the home, but usually that is being used as a metaphor for the cosmic order or the cosmic temple, kind of like how the temple is a cosmology, like the home is too. And so I think that there is like a thread where you can say it's a divine feminine.
When you read some of the Psalms, by King David, he does use that reference that you weaved me in my mother's womb.
Yes, and it's always tied to a mother. And the question is, he's talking to Jehovah, so he's communing with Jehovah, but the idea of the weaving, it's actually it's a feminine thing, right? Like the mother's womb is where the weaving occurs. Without that mother, there's no weaving, if that makes sense. And so there are like all of these really beautiful connections there that you can make. Now, one of the other things that's really interesting, so there's prophetic authority that's happening with Deborah. She's a prophetess. She like held a court beneath a palm tree in a hill country of Ephraim. And so she's like literally like acting as a prophetess. And unlike other judges who were primarily like military deliverers, she was recognized as a legal arbiter to whom the children of Israel came up for judgment. And there's also this call to action here. So when the Canaanite king Jabin oppressed Israel for 20 years, Deborah received a divine commission. She summoned the warrior Barak, commanding him in the name of the Lord to gather 10,000 men at Mount Tabor. So they're actually taking some military direction from her because of her prophetic insight and foresight. And then they end up in this victory. So her like conviction, quote, is not the Lord gone out before thee, unquote. This inspired the army to face 900 iron chariots. And so her narrative gets preserved in both prose and also some of like the oldest poetry that we have in the Bible. And it celebrates this victory where the Lord intervenes, and there's there's this like miraculous flood at the river Kishon. And so there's some really cool, amazing events that are happening here, but we have like the spirit of revelation, this divine rebuke. Like some LDS scholars suggest that Deborah being raised as a spokesperson for the Lord may have been an indication of the failure of the priesthood, like the men's failures to honor their responsibilities during this era of apostasy. And so again, you see a woman acting as an intercessor. And as far as like Revelation, I mean, she's really receiving prophecies and they're coming to pass. And then there's this like expansive mothering idea. So similar to Miriam, you have this title mother in Israel that you see in Judges 5:7. And a lot of LDS like scholarly circles, they look at this as a model of expansive mothering where a woman's influence extends beyond her own family to the spiritual nurture and deliverance of the entire Israelite nation. And then you have these poetic parallelisms, which I pulled an example of just to show you what this looks like so you can try to identify it in those chapters as you're reading this week. But the Song of Deborah, it's this really beautiful masterpiece of ancient Hebrew poetics. It utilizes synonymous parallelisms where one line echoes another for emphasis to testify of God's power. So an example would be like the mountains quake before the Lord, even Sinai before the Lord. And so there's a lot of really great examples that you can look at in Judges 4 and 5 on that. So there's also this really cool, if you'll go to the next slide, this really cool idea happening here. There's this continuation of that pattern of apostasy that we see, the pride cycle. It looks a little different in Judges, but it's there. So Judges, it's this really kind of carefully woven story. It's happening in multiple literary forms too. Like if you're going to look at the literary analysis, there's historical prose, there's the epic poetry, there's this covenant cycle, which is one literary element, and then there's the symbolic imagery. And all of this, the purpose of this book is to preserve Israel's testimony of divine deliverance during a really fragmented, chaotic era. And this, so the paired accounts of like Judges 4 and 5, they function like this like interlaced, like interwoven threads that present these prose and this like these historical events through this poetry and these literary tools. And it actually goes to the cosmic level. So you'll see kind of like a cosmic and covenantal imagery coming in. It's portraying like heaven, stars, rivers, creation itself is fighting on behalf of Jehovah's people. So you have the Lord, kind of like with the parting of the Red Sea, the elements are working in favor of the Lord's people. And these are some of those miracles that I think we always like, we read about them, but I don't know if we really have the faith sometimes to believe that this can still happen. But this comes with a collective covenant and a collective righteousness and a collective faith. So there's this really sophisticated literary structure that reflects what Latter-day Saint scholars describe as literary genius of ancient prophets and prophetesses who used poetic parallelisms, symbolic repetition, and layered narrative forms to preserve a sacred memory. So all of that gospel is like the doctrine of the gospel is being preserved through this. And there's this recurring covenant cycle of sin, oppression, repentance, and deliverance that plays a part in forming that literary fabric, if you will, this woven story. So you can think of it like the divine tapestry, how we kind of started that theme with Genesis. But there is a tapestry of testimony in the book of Judges where you get this like record that combines all of these different styles of literary composition to be able to express what turns out to be a really beautiful, I think, narrative. Now, if you go to the next slide, you have this idea of Deborah beneath the sacred palm. So Deborah's leadership in the book of Judges, it doesn't begin on the battlefield. It actually begins beneath a sacred palm tree. So here's that tree idea that you were talking about, Tim, with like the Book of Mormon and the tree and Mary, and you get it right here with this palm tree. So this is where she served as both prophetess and judge for Israel. As the only like female named judge in the Hebrew Bible, Deborah combines spiritual revelation with legal and political authority. And she becomes this stabilizing mother in Israel during this time of national apostasy and oppression. But her location beneath the palm they call it the palm of Deborah. It symbolized wisdom. So there's that like wisdom and tree connection. mediation, which is the intercessor idea, and like covenant guidance. So she's like giving guidance. Think of Rebecca with Jacob and the guidance that she gave him. And then this is linking her to these like ancient traditions of sacred trees, like the groves, and that is an idea of like an inspired leadership. Like it's coming
Right.
through the spirit. They're being inspired. And so some scholars actually note that the Hebrew phrase Ashet Lapidoth may not merely mean wife of Lapidoth, but it might actually mean woman of torches or fiery woman, which may be a title for Deborah. And
Well,
this would
today we call them
emphasize,
firecrackers.
yes, she's a firecracker. But what it means, what it's pointing to is actually her prophetic energy. So it's talking about like her courage, her strength, her prophetic energy, and her spiritual authority. And from this judgment seat, Deborah receives revelation to summon Barak. She initiates that deliverance that comes to Israel. And so it's demonstrating how God can raise these inspired women. And what is their role? They preserve, they guide, they defend. The covenant community comes to them for spiritual wisdom and prophecy. They prophesy. So
So
I don't know if you guys have thoughts on that, but I like that.
I do, because there's one thing that's really standing out. Sophet, a charismatic leader and mediator dispensing justice. We know that when we read like through Proverbs, that wisdom is always in the feminine of Hebrew. It's always pointing to Sophia. It's the that wisdom is always in the feminine connotation of Hebrew, from what I've understood and researched. And and so it speaks to, because what does it say? It says the fear of the Lord begins with wisdom.
Yeah, it does.
Right.
And I think that, again, if you're going back to Eden, maybe tie all that together, just because
Right.
this is the intercessor, the wise one. Eve was wise, okay? And I know that there's a lot of people who really want to hold on to this tradition that she was deceived and beguiled, and like almost as if she was stupid and she didn't know or understand. But I've been taking a linguistics class, and I'm telling you, there's so much linguistic evidence. And even when you're looking to like the Ugaritic and the Akkadian texts and all of these other like influences like the Persian on the Hebrew Bible, you can see that there is like a preservation of what these things actually should mean. Like the KJV, I'm sorry, it is the worst translation of Genesis. It is absolutely the worst. It does
Right.
not capture what
Base take.
yeah, like what is the Ezer Canendo? Is she a helpmeet? No, that is the worst possible translation. And so we kind of talked about that back in Genesis, and I didn't have slides
Right.
back then. I've gotten pretty good at doing the slides, and I feel like I should go back and do that one. But my point is that this idea of the wisdom, and like all those wisdom literatures, the tree, the groves, like all of those things,
Right.
the Canaanites, they were taking what appears to be a real true Israelite kind of tradition, but they were doing like false god worship. They were making sacrifices, like evil
Right.
human sacrifices, like all kinds of stuff was so corrupt about it. And so I guess what I'm kind of figuring out from doing the linguistic studies that I've been doing is that there is some true tradition there that ends up
Right.
maybe getting collapsed, like we were talking about last week with the Deuteronomy reforms, like the Deuteronomist reforms, that it does kind of somehow start to get lost along the way through apostasy after
Yeah.
apostasy. And you can see right here in Judges, they just inherit the promised land. Joshua dies, and then they're already in chaos again, like total chaos. Now, I don't want to use chaos the wrong way, because I really should be saying
Right.
anarchy, because chaos is actually a really beautiful motif. It means it is tied to the divine feminine.
Right.
And you can think of like the primordial waters, or like the chaotic element, or the base element, the base intelligence, if you will, to use some, Pearl of Great Price Doctrine and Covenants language. But it is tied to that feminine archetype too. And so wisdom and chaos are kind of connected. And
Right.
I think that's an interesting motif too, which I didn't really pull into this, but the palm of Deborah this is like her headquarters. It's like her little headquarters is this palm tree.
Right.
And it's between Ramah and Bethel. Do you guys remember Bethel from
Yeah,
Genesis?
it's where Jacob,
Hmm.
where he
And Jacob's Well and all of that stuff.
Jacob's well, yes.
So it's
Yeah,
like a really important place, and it's between those two places is where her headquarters are. So
right.
do you see how it's kind of showing you this idea kind of esoterically, how the women are kind of in that in-between space, and there's like this idea of intercessor, reconciliation, judgment, like the
Yeah,
wisdom. This is what women do. Like, think about your moms, guys, like, especially if you have a really good mom and she has good counsel for you. And I mean, just think about that idea for a little bit, because I think there is maybe like a divine feminine trait that
word.
perhaps we all can tap into, that helps
Well,
us be
yeah.
mothers in
The
Israel.
other thing I want to point out too, and I'm learning this year as I look more into this and going deeper into this, is that when you look at the menorah actually is a representation of the tree of life.
Hmm.
And so the menorah stood in so you had the outer court, and then in the inner temple that we talked about before you get into the Holy of Holies, you had the menorah. But then you also had the tree. When we get to King Solomon building the first temple, the tree of life was actually, from what I understand, was a mural in in Solomon's temple, in the first temple as well. And so the
Yeah.
representation of the tree of life
There were also two
being
trees at the entrance, like one on each side.
right. And this is just what amazes me about scripture, is because you think about the palm trees. When Christ came into Jerusalem, they laid down palm leaves.
Hmm. Yeah, they did. And all of this kind of goes back to that tree symbolism again, and the tree of life in the tree motif in the Book of Mormon. And anyway, go to the next slide. Let's talk about Jael. We have a lot of slides to get through, and I want to show you guys some of
Right.
these literary structures that are coming up. So
Okay.
this is an interesting story, a little gruesome, but has a really good idea that I think you can get out of this. So just to summarize this, there's this domestic battlefields going on here. So, in a dramatic fulfillment of prophecy, the Canaanite general Sisera was defeated, not on the open field by a soldier, but within the private sanctuary of a nomad's tent. Jael, a Kenite woman, and remember, this was the Kenites are the ones that descended through Keturah and were associated with the Midianites. They were closely related with them.
Right.
Well, she utilizes the tools of daily life and hospitality, a hammer, and a tent peg to deliver Israel from its oppressor. Her story serves as a powerful testament to how the Lord can transform humble domestic spaces into sites of divine victory and covenant preservation. And one of the things that I wanted to point out about this is these kind of like the things that I think you can pick up on as you're reading through these verses. So you can look at Judges chapter 4 verse 9. You've got Deborah's prophecy that the Lord would
Mhm.
sell Sisera into the hand of a woman. Now, what to give like a little A&E background here, for a leader to die by the hand of a woman was so embarrassing that if there was like, let's say a woman almost killed the guy, but he was like bleeding out or something, he would have his soldier actually kill him just so he didn't die by the hand of a woman. Like, that's how serious, like, this was an affront to the reputation of the warrior, the man who died.
Mhm.
To be killed by a woman, it's like, oh no, that's like the worst way to go. So this is like a slap in the face to Sisera and anyone who liked him, including his mother. And then you have in chapter 4, verses 17 and 18, this is where Jael is welcoming Sisera into her tent. So she's being hospitable and inviting him into her tent. And then in verse 21, you have the prose that account, like, so basically Jael is like slaying Sisera with a tent nail and a hammer. So this is the staking that we were just talking about in the first stake president. And then you have Judges 5:24-27. This is like where that poetic celebration of Jael's victory gets recorded in the Song of Deborah. And the conclusion is in verse 31 of chapter 5, that her act led to 40 years of peace in the land. So one thing that I want to point out symbolically, and this is kind of interesting. So remember when we were talking about with the story of the midwives, how they would have these birthing stools that they would lean on, and they would give birth, and the baby obviously comes out between the legs. Well, Jael dies between the legs of a woman. Okay, he falls at her feet. And in one of the Jewish traditions, like one of their kind of like commentaries, it noted how this is really interesting symbolically, because there's like this idea of life and death. And it's like normally this is the place where the life is given, but in this story, this is where the life is taken. And so what you're seeing is that there's some kind of, I don't know, like interesting symmetry happening there. And what's ultimately happening, and this is what LDS scholars have said, and I pulled a bunch of notes on this, but a lot of LDS scholars identify Jael as what they call a covenant deliverer, or, quote, an unexpected heroine. And she acts as this like vital protector of Israel, even though she herself is not, she's like an outsider. So there's that outsider idea again that we're seeing. Well, her actions are viewed as the specific fulfillment of Deborah's prophecy that the Lord would sell the Canaanite general Sisera into the hand of a woman. Scholars like Stephen O. Smoot, he highlighted how there's this really rich irony happening in Jael's treatment of Sisera, noting that she had lulled him into a false sense of security by treating him with maternal care, offering him milk and a blanket before his grisly demise. And then other scholars' perspectives were that I was trying to like summarize here, they kind of emphasize the symbolism of the domestic space, how this is used as kind of like a metaphor for bigger lessons. But it observes that Jael used ordinary household tools to be able to achieve this. And this kind of transformed her tent into a site of divine victory and covenant preservation. And Donald W. Perry, he's one of my favorite biblical Hebrew scholars that is LDS. I've read a lot of his books. But him and a few other researchers noted that the poetic Song of Deborah exalts Jael for her role, illustrating that there's this interplay happening between divine power and human agency. And so there's a connection there between power and agency. And then Ellis Rasmussen categorized the account of her victory as heroic poetry that serves as an invaluable cultural artifact of a highly literate and faithful ancient people. And then other scholars, they actually compare Jael to other heroic covenant women like Rahab. So there's a similarity between Rahab, who was also an outsider that came into the covenant. You could also look at Esther and Judith, who are going to come up later. And each of these use their unique positions and what's perceived as a weakness to actually destroy the enemies of God. So think about God making weak things strong with that lens on.
Right.
And think about like Ether chapter 12, how God gives men weakness, but ultimately this serves his purpose. And so anyway, while Jael was a Kenite rather than an Israelite, her actions are seen as a manifestation of covenant loyalty, drawing upon the Kenites' ancestral ties to Jethro and Moses. And ultimately, her story is cited as a primary example of how the Lord works through small and simple things to bring great things to pass. So that's kind of like the little summary of Jael. What do you guys think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because
You want to go to the next slide while you're talking too, because it's got some cool little stuff that people can look at while you're talking.
So, what brings to mind is the powerful influence.
Yeah, the mountain
women
goat
have.
thing.
The powerful influence women have, and it's just amazing how God designed us to fulfill certain roles, to step into certain callings and capacities, and how he works with us work through the priesthood, work through women to do do his will, and it's just interesting because the more I learn about this, the more I study and understand this, the more I realize that you can't just approach these types of scriptures just on a surface level. You can't just literally, oh, this is a good story, because if you don't understand the symbolism behind it, the message it really is wanting to convey, you're going to miss a lot of this stuff.
Well, I think the gospel doctrine is actually recorded in all of these symbols. Like, if you really want to understand
Right.
gospel doctrine, like, there's different ways you can look at this story. You don't have to
Mhm.
look at it just one way. And that's what's so
Right.
interesting. In fact, when I was doing research on this, and I have this as a note on this slide that you're on, Tim, where it's just kind of pointing out the
Mhm.
interesting idea of this weaponry of the home. And there's also some rabbinic traditions or interpretations, and I noted a few. One of them was from the Talmud, and according to the
Mhm.
Talmud, Jael actually engaged in sexual intercourse with Sisera 7 times. And the purpose of
Wow.
this multi-coital nature, it said, which I thought was
Coitus.
kind of a weird phrase, but it was actually to exhaust him so that she could kill him. Now, this is a tradition, so this isn't actually in the text, so who knows? But that's how they were interpreting it and talking about it. And then
Talking about
there's also
unaliving
this
somebody softly.
seriously. And then there's also this like alternative rabbinic
Mhm.
um tradition where there's like this opposing view about this, asserting that Jael never engaged in this type of act with
Right.
Sisera and that her actions were purely an act of military deliverance. So there's kind of like competing opinions there.
Mhm.
And then some of the other commenters, they had proposed that Jael killed Sisera in a manner that mirrored his own army's use of rape as a weapon of war,
Oh,
portraying her as a marginal hero who conquered a well-armed enemy through wit and stealth. So, and
right.
where you see how he dies by the hand of a woman and just what that means symbolically, that one kind of resonated the most with me, I think. It was just this idea that it's really using the irony to illustrate the power that she had as a woman, that she defeated a man that no other man was able to defeat.
Right.
And I thought that was really, I don't know, just like an interesting layer to think about. And I feel like I could spend a lot of time on that. But the fact that she like puts a tent peg through his head, I was like, dang, that's brutal. Where did she get that idea? I don't
That
know.
is
But she's
brutal.
using these like household tools to do it. So she's using what she has at her disposal,
Right.
including her feminine wiles or her motherly instincts, to be able to defeat this enemy. And it made me think, like, if you're a mother in Israel today and you are trying to protect your family or your little nation, and you have to use all the tools at your disposal, what are your tools? What do you have? This is kind of
Yeah.
rhetorical. You guys can have that as food for thought, but it made me think a little outside the box. And so Tim, if you want to go to the next slide, I only have bullet points on these. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them. Just
Right.
on a few of these, I've just got a few little bullet points. But on in terms of the song, um, I think like a really short summary would be that Deborah, she introduces this song. It's like a literary monument sharing the structural DNA with like 13th century BCE Egyptian victory hymns. So structurally, the way this Song of Deborah is composed, it actually mirrors 13th century Egyptian hymns.
Mhm.
And that I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Donald W. Perry actually noted this, and he called her a literary genius. He spent a little time. He has like a little podcast that he's doing with Tamara Uzelak Hall where they're just putting little notes out. And I think it's called Finding Christ in the Old Testament, something like that. You can look it up on YouTube, but they just do little shorts. And he had talked about this. And then Tim, go to the next slide. But there's like these two threads of ancient record keeping that are happening here. And so this prose and poetry pairing, it's like this cutting edge literary innovation in the 13th century BCE. And by utilizing this structure, the authors created an official royal style record of victory rather than a simple folk tune. So basically the idea you can get is this is like official. This is like a kingdom record, like that, the way that they're like encapsulating this story. And so I don't know, I just kind of like this idea. Ellis Rasmussen, he had categorized the song as like a heroic poetry or like a cultural artifact from a really highly literate people, proving that they're not just primitive tribes. Like these people are literate. They're writing this level of poetry. And this also mirrors this Arabic, I don't know how to say this, but it's qasida model of poetry. So this is where a historical introduction or prose is provided before the memorized rhythmic poem. So it has like a cadence or a rhythm to it. And here's an example on the next slide, if you'll click over to that. But it's the one titled Visualizing the Poetry, Synonymous Parallelism. So here's examples of what that looks like. So when you guys are reading this story this week, see if you can find some of these types of little parallels that are happening, and notice the staccato rhythm or the repetition and how that creates this like kind of relentless driving beat that reflects the march of an army. And there's this like theophany happening where the poetry is linking the current victory back to the foundational covenant that's made at Mount Sinai, which we went in depth about. And so there's like this structural symmetry happening here. So basically the literary artistry found in the book of Judges, by you'll see it the most right here in the Song of Deborah. And it's throughout the book, but like you'll see it the most in this chapter. And it specifically illustrates the concept of parallelism. Like it's a great example if you want to understand parallelism. And so that's where those like the consecutive lines are kind of like mirroring the previous lines, and they're using different words, but what that does is it links those ideas. So here is linked to give ear. O ye kings is linked to O ye princes. And what you can do when you start to identify these things is you can realize that all of those should be together. They should be read synonymously together. And in the book of Isaiah, this is how the bifid structure in Isaiah was identified. It's through these kinds of parallels. They have both the ones that are like themed, like the synonymous themes, but then they also have antithetical themes, and it's in Isaiah they're antithetical, so you would see like opposites paralleled together. And this is a really great way to study the scriptures if you want to understand more. So like right there where it says here, so this highlights an example where you have this poetic device. It's repeating two, using different words, but by addressing both kings and princes, the text signals a universal call to attention, demanding that those in positions of high authority listen closely to the divine message. The highlighted structure specifically pairs the commands to hear and give ear, reinforcing the gravity of the proclamation through synonymous reinforcement. Ultimately, this literary technique serves to elevate the tone of the verse, ensuring that the listener recognizes the supreme importance of the words being delivered. And then in that next one where it's using mountains and Sinai, this is why it's linking back to Sinai. You're supposed to think of Sinai when you read that. Well, in this verse, it's trying to illustrate the overwhelming power of God's presence over the physical world. And by focusing on how massive natural structures like the mountains trembling, this is emphasizing the supreme authority of the creator over all existence. And the specific mention of Sinai serves as that historical anchor. So you know that you should be looking at that as your foundation for the principle that's being taught here.
Right.
It's sort of like that little quick phrase in Helaman, oh, remember, my sons. He's really trying to emphasize the next message.
Same verse, the rock.
Right.
Those both are, remember and rock are both in that verse.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
And
I'm specifically referencing the fact that it repeats itself. Remember. He's trying to add the extra emphasis that my next message is of the utmost importance of everything that I'm telling to you.
Yeah, like how he's saying it. Yeah, I see what you mean, like the repetition. Yeah. And there's, when you see it 3 times, that's where it's like the ultimate.
Yeah.
And you'll see that in the book of Revelation a lot, like, whoa, be unto you people. So anyway, it's really, really cool. And so then go to the next slide, Tim. There's this really cool, like, royal commemoration of divine victory happening with the Song of Deborah, where in the book of Judges, it's the whole book kind of stands as like one of the oldest and most sophisticated literary compositions, but specifically Deborah's song is the one that's like amazing. And it's blending this historical memory, covenant theology, epic poetry, all into this like powerful testimony of Jehovah's supremacy. Scholars have noted striking parallels between Judges 5 and the Egyptian royal battle hymns, as I mentioned earlier, that are like poems. So an example would be Ramses II and I don't know how to say this, but Marin Tepa Stile. I don't know. Where's Jonathan? He's the Egyptologist guy. I don't know how to say that. Particularly in their use of paired prose and poetry. So she's mirroring these ideas in her same use of the prose and the poetry, where there's this divine warrior imagery and there's this like miraculous victory motif. And this is where there's also like taunts against defeated enemies. That's part of those old Egyptian styles of poetry. But Deborah's song actually transforms these imperial literary forms by redirecting glory away from human kings, whereas the Egyptians, they focused on their pharaohs. And she puts that all towards Jehovah. So she's identifying Jehovah as the true warrior, and she's identifying his power over the stars, the storms, the rivers, the nations, in helping them win that battle. What looked like it would be doomed, that they couldn't win, and then he helps them have that victory. So think of the walls of Jericho coming down, right? They're marching around and the walls come down. It's like these kinds of things that are happening are so miraculous, you can't deny that the hand of God is there. And so she's highlighting that. And unlike these ancient Egypt style poems, she's not attributing any of this to humankind.
That thing really quick that you just said, with the river, do you know which part I'm talking about? There was like three things.
What?
There was like three things that you just read in reference to like,
the stars, the storms, the rivers, and the nations.
Okay, so those four things really quick are what Baal and Aseroth are like over, as well as fertility. But I mean, in this context, that doesn't really matter. But one thing that I've been really keen on in this read through of the Old Testament has been the fact that Jehovah routinely will take what these other gods are supposed to be doing, and he's really emphasizing, I am greater than they all.
And he does it in Isaiah.
He does it so much. He does it an unbelievable amount, and it really puts emphasis on the whole, I, the Lord God, am a jealous God. When it talks about that, I don't view it as being petty. I think he's saying, you were looking to these other divine beings, and I'm showing up for you. And therefore, I require exclusive worship. And it's like, I don't view it as petty. I view it as him saying, I'm the one who is faithful and is willing to save. That kind of idea. And it's if you see it, then it's like one of those like, okay, that makes a lot of sense why he's doing what he's doing in this context.
Yeah. So I have kind of an overview coming up of like the ways that Deborah illustrates this. But one of the things you can look at is in Judges chapter 5, verse 4-5. You're going to see this, what the scholars were calling a divine step out motif. And it says, Lord, when thou wentest out of Seir, when thou marchest out of the fields of Edom, the earth trembled. And so this is like a coming out with force. And this is another element that mirrors these ancient Egyptian styles of poetry. And again, this is speaking to these people's great literary skills, their wisdom. And this is why I think there's so many layers in the Old Testament, because this Hebrew style of writing, it has all these layers. And so you shouldn't just say, well, I know that story, I'm familiar with it, I'm done studying it, I know, the primary lesson, because there's tons of layers here, and there's all kinds of really beautiful gospel doctrine that is kind of like hidden within the text. There's like a story within a story. And so anyway,
note really quick, I've noticed, so as I've been tempted to learn biblical Hebrew and then realizing what a daunting task that is, I just read like what the scholarship says and whatnot, but Hebrew is a much like smaller language than something like English, right? Like as far as like vocabulary, we have thousands of words. They literally only have a few hundred. And so this layered meaning is how they elaborate more exhaustive ideas and concepts, because their language they don't just go on and on like an encyclopedia. They have a very few amount of words, And so they layer it to teach the principle through structure rather than actual like explanation.
Yeah.
Therefore, by leaving it open ended, it leads you into much deeper and deeper principles that the Lord is trying to teach them.
Well, and I'll
that's
just
what's been
add
very
that,
cool.
they have checks and balances though. And that's
Mhm.
what those parallelisms are.
Right.
Because you could totally like isolate a verse and cherry pick and proof text a verse, but you can't do that if you're looking at the parallelisms and the literary structure. You cannot do that because you'll find that you're in error many times the way you're interpreting one verse out of context. The full context is in the literary structure.
Yeah, you're breaking the principle basically.
Yes.
When you do that.
Right.
The grammar principles that are governing how you should interpret it.
Right.
The interpretation is in the structure. And
Right.
the rules for interpreting it is in the structure. And this is the mistake that I think we make. We all do this. I mean, we all are not familiar with this like Hebrew style of writing. It's something why I think Nephi, he talks about the manner of the Jews. And I think this is one of the things he was, maybe even the main thing that he was talking about, is it's kind of like, hey, you kind of need to understand this to be able to get all of this, because we're writing in this manner in a Egyptian language. And when they talk about this in the Book of Mormon, you can kind of see that they're saying that the language that they're using for writing is limited, but the ideas that they're trying to convey have this layered meaning. And anyway, that there's this in the Book of Mormon too. These parallelisms exist there. Just the exact same structure that you're seeing in Deborah's song, it exists in the Book of Mormon. There's tons of examples. Donald Perry had pointed out a bunch of these. He has all kinds of resources at length where he talks about how this literary device and this like sophisticated like biblical poetry is happening all throughout the Book of Mormon. And I'm telling you, there's no way Joseph Smith could have written that. You'll even find this in the Doctrine and Covenants and the revelations that Joseph Smith received. And so that's like another interesting thing to think about. But think about this. So Judges 4, Judges 5, there's prose in chapter 4 plus poetry structure happening in 4 and 5. You have this comparison to these old Egyptian styles of writing that's happening with Deborah. There's this like stepping out and divine warrior motif that matches those ancient Egyptian styles of writing. You've got Ammon granting victory, where stars are fighting for Israel. And where you can see that is in Judges 5:20, where it says they fought from heaven. The stars in their courses fought against Sisera. So you can see how Jehovah is actually like using the elements against Sisera, against Israel's enemies. And then you can see how in, Judges 28, 5:28 through 30, where it talks about the mother of Sisera looked out a window. We're going to talk about that. There's a really interesting thought there. And that's part of the literary structure. And then you also have the highways were unoccupied and travelers walked through byways in Judges 5:6. And this is where you see like the victory through restored social order. So Israel's roads were empty and unsafe before Deborah's intervention. And it's just really interesting how you kind of have all of these little elements that speak to a sophisticated writing style that I think, in my opinion, has like a hidden message or hidden code. Now, if you'll go to the next slide, Tim, I have an example of just kind of how you can compare to that, to the Arabic and the Egyptian. And we don't have to spend a lot of time on this, but basically they both present Jehovah, like she presents Jehovah versus like kings or, other human people as the true divine warrior. So it's basically, to Scoob's point, Jehovah's saying there's all these other, and just the style of poetry that she's doing, where she's hearkening to these styles where kings are being exalted. Jehovah's like, no, I'm the one. And he does this through Deborah. So there's this act of covenant preservation. And remember how we talked about Miriam with the timbrel and how she does the song after they come through the parting of the Red Sea, and they come through that, and then she starts singing a song. So not only weaving, but song is tied to women. And we had talked about that in that episode that we did on the parting of the Red Sea and Miriam and her role. And I also did like a little short video where I talked about this a little bit too. But there's so much there that I think is speaking to a role that women are playing. They're actually the ones who keep the songs, and in the songs is where they keep the history the gospel doctrine and the interpretations of these doctrines. And
Right.
you're going to see this again later with Huldah. And the point that I'm trying to make by bringing this up is something to think about as you're reading through these chapters. But look at these women and make note of all of the weaving motifs and the song motifs, because they are specifically tied to the women. And when later people are going to come to Huldah for an interpretation, there's a reason why they're coming to her. It's because she has the authority. This is part of her role. And you see this
Right.
happening with Deborah too. She seems to have a role or responsibility or stewardship, I guess you could say, that she's keeping track of this history and this victory and this intercession in Israel's history by Jehovah in song, and she's preserving the covenant memory. And that was part of what we've been talking about, that all these women are doing. They're preserving the covenant memory. And
This reminds me because one of the things that actually helped me come back to the church was coming across Pedro de Ciezo de Leon's work in Second Chronicles Peru, and in the fifth chapter, where he opens up, where he talks about before the Incas reigned, and he's describing this event that they were a long time without seeing the sun. um and he describes what we read in Third Nephi about the destruction and Christ coming. It doesn't give any specific details, but it says that from a southern direction, a man of great stature came from the direction of Lake, what we call it, Lake Titicaca, there in Bolivia and Peru, on the border of Bolivia and Peru. But he says that they relayed this down through the old songs and hymns that even predate the Incas.
yeah, because before there was written language, there was an oral tradition. And even the
Right.
Hebrew Bible, it actually comes from a more ancient oral tradition. But with all of the apostasy that was happening, they started to lose some of their traditions. And this is how we end up with this kind of like flattening from this polysemic view to like this weird monotheistic like rule,
Right.
where it's like you can see them losing some of their gospel doctrine along the
Right.
way. Every time they get
They're
congregating
Josiah.
together. Yeah.
Yeah, they're losing the beauty of the message, and yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's really interesting, but what I love is understanding that we have this, you guys. Like we have this
Right.
in the church today, and we have this understanding that's so ancient and it's so beautiful, and it's not it is so perfectly aligned with the Old Testament. Like if
Mhm.
you look at the Doctrine and Covenants, think about last year what we were studying and talking about together. It is so on par with this. It's almost like the entire history of the house of Israel has been condensed from the time of Joseph Smith to the second coming. It's like all
Right.
condensed. And if you go to the next slide, Tim, this is where you can see the breakdown of the literary motifs and then how they compare to those Egyptian royal
Right.
battle hymns. And I won't spend too much time on that one, but you can kind of just see, I tried to like put it where you can just see those kind of like four little elements that I just mentioned: that divine step out, the
Right.
hero's isolation, the supernatural intervention, like the cosmos being included here. And then you have that taunt, the taunting of the
Mhm.
enemies. And so those are all parts of what make this something that can be really closely compared to those old Egyptian battle hymns. And then go ahead and go to the next slide. And this is where we have kind of like another theme. This is adopt, adapt, and surpass. And so the Song of Deborah, it demonstrates how Israel adopted these great literary forms of surrounding empires, but then they adapted them to covenant theology of their own.
Right.
And they ultimately surpassed them by centering all the glory on Jehovah rather than on human kings or imperial powers in
Right.
terms of their I don't know, like their righteousness, I guess you could say, their covenant loyalty to Jesus Christ. And she gives all the credit to the Lord and no credit to themselves in her poetry.
Right.
And the restoration of open roads and secure travel in Judges 5 is kind of part of this, but it echoes this ancient Near Eastern ideal of social harmony and order that existed at the time. The biblical text attributes that restoration entirely to God's covenant rather than the empire or the military domination, which is what those other Egyptian battle hymns would have attributed their successes to. And then the Song of Deborah actually becomes a standard of the nations, showing that Israel's greatest strength wasn't chariots, armies, political might, but the presence of Jehovah among his people. And it kind of reminds me, you guys, of, do you ever remember that quote by Neil A. Maxwell where he talked about how he wonders if, you know, someday when we look back on human history, we'll be able to see that it's not all of the military successes like that amounted to the success of the restoration of God's family. It's actually just what happens at kitchen tables and cradles. And it was just such a beautiful remark. I'm like totally butchering it. You guys should look it up. It's like kitchen tables and cradles. And it was just a beautiful thought. But this is kind of what I think we're seeing with Jael and Deborah, is that is where the true success lies. If you're going to raise a nation of righteous people, you need righteous mothers. If you go to the next slide, this is that cosmic warfare idea where the heavens align and you're seeing that divine intervention, that flash flood. So this is Jehovah commanding the elements. This is a really important part of understanding themes that are going to, this is actually going to be in Isaiah, in all these things. You're going to see like the idea of the waters. They can be, basically think of chaos as necessary for creation. So you have to like be decreated to be recreated. And this is the idea of descent and ascent, but it's just coming in different metaphors, but it's the same concept. It's you have to like, you know, go down into the chaos to come up to ascend to the next level, if that makes sense, or pass through that chaotic waters. And don't think of chaos as anarchy. That's not what it means. Think of chaos as going back to the pure element. Okay.
Well, I think so. I wanna point something
The
out
dust
doctrinally here.
motif.
I want to point something out doctrinally because this is what struck me with that. Because when you think about baptism, we understand that we enter the waters of baptism, and we are entering the waters of baptism to make covenants with Christ. And when you read what Paul is writing in Romans 6, where he says that you are baptized unto his death, you are buried with him, and then you are risen up in newness of life with him. So we come into faith from a chaotic state, from a chaotic existence. We're coming in with a lot of pain, a lot of baggage, a lot of trauma, a lot of hurt, a lot of spiritual rebellion, and all kinds of things that just make us human. And we enter into the waters of baptism. So we're going down in a chaotic state. And then we are being buried in that chaotic state, only to rise up with a newness of life. That we are
it's
no
the
longer,
arise.
we are brought out of chaos and brought into a life of order, a life of
And you have to make the order like from the chaos, right? That's
right,
the idea. And if you'll go
right.
to the next slide, Tim, this is where you get the part that has to do with Sisera's mother. And I just title it A Tale of Two Mothers because that's how it was presented in the scholarship that I was reading.
Mhm,
And it's basically contrasting destinies. So the Song of Deborah, it employs this literary device where you're seeing opposites. So you've got this tale of two mothers to illustrate the difference between a covenant victory versus like a worldly victory. So you'll see a worldly defeat compared to the covenant victory, or like in connection with the covenant victory. And on one hand, you've got Deborah, who stands as this mother of Israel, of the nation, to
mhm,
deliver her people from spiritual and physical oppression. And then on the other hand, you have this mother of Sisera in this story. So when you guys are reading this week, pay attention to Sisera's mother and her stance. She has this like really poignant but tragic kind of, I don't know, idea happening here where you've got her peering through a lattice, waiting for her son Sisera, who's never going to return. And this contrasts like what's happening with Israel compared to what's
mhm,
happening with these other people who are seeking a worldly defeat. They end
right,
up getting conquered by the God of Israel. And so again, this is just kind of showing who has all the power. Jehovah has all the power. These people have no power
right,
over him. And there's just a lot of irony in the story, and especially in this specific scene, because you're seeing this victory through conquest, power, and luxury textiles, which lattice was at the time. This was a luxury textile. So this is kind of helping you identify that Sisera's mother is a woman of luxury and leisure. And it's all leading into Israel's deliverance, which is coming through their covenant faithfulness by listening and heeding this prophetess Deborah. And so the divine intervention comes because the people are listening to Deborah.
Right.
And I don't know, I just love this idea. It's a really cool kind of parallel, the tale of two mothers. Just think of like the mother in Israel versus this worldly mother at the lattice. And so, you've got this like, the scholars are calling it a sophisticated literary maneuver here. That's what they called it. And they're saying that it's a really good way to present a teaching. It's through the irony. So you've got the wise ladies of the Canaanite court that attempt to comfort Sisera's mother by telling her, oh, Sisera's just delayed. He'll be here. Don't worry. He's probably dividing the spoils of war and he's never going to come home. And so you've got this, I don't know, just kind of interesting
it
way
almost gives you that false hope.
Yes,
that
that's what
we
it is,
hold on to
false
this
hope.
false hope that,
Yes.
everything's going to be okay. And we're not looking to God. We're not seeking his direction, but we're relying on the false hope of
Sisera's like might is what they're
Right.
relying on, like the
Yeah.
putting the trust in the arm of flesh. Like he's so powerful, that nobody can stop him. And really in the end, he is defeated and by a woman. Remember, this is like the biggest
Right.
shameful slap in the face he could ever have. It's embarrassing to him and embarrassing to his family and his friends. And so anyway, the cosmic conclusion here is that this ends with this final plea. So let all thine enemies perish, O Lord. But there's this idea that those that love him be as, quote, the sun when he goeth forth in his might. And so think of the sun, like the power of the sun, not like sun as in Jesus is the sun, but he's being compared to the power of the sun. And so there's kind of like that celestial cosmic idea that's part of this beautiful poetry.
Right.
And so anyway, I just thought that was really cool. There's that like expansive mothering, mother versus priestess idea, the wise ladies, the false religious structures versus the true followers of Jehovah. There's the arm of flesh versus the arm of Jehovah. All of that is going on here. And then when you go into, this is where we get the tapestry. If you go over to the sacred tapestry, I think it's slide number 28. This is where you see the blue thread and the red thread. And remember, I've talked about that. I just, at the very beginning of this, if for those of you who came on late, just rewind at the end of this and go back to the beginning. And I reviewed all of that, what this means. But there's basically like a white linen thread, a blue thread, and a red thread. It starts with the white, and then there's the red, and then there's the blue. And the blue is tied to the healing of the woman with the issue of blood when she touches Jehovah's garment or Jesus's garment in the New Testament. The red starts with really Jacob and Esau, and then it really becomes a thing called the scarlet thread in the story of Tamar. And then you can look at the linen thread. They start out white. You start out white, your garment gets dipped in blood, and then there's this blue, the healing that happens, and then this forms the blue and the red form purple, like royalty. And then ultimately you're made white again through this blood and this royal priesthood. And so that's the idea that's happening there. Well, I think this is really one of the most sophisticated poems that I'm seeing. I've looked at a lot in Isaiah, a lot of other areas of the Bible, and I had never really spent time on Deborah's, but I do see this weaving together of history, a covenant theology, cosmic imagery, this literary artistry into this sacred tapestry of the story of deliverance for all of us. And I see all of this kind of pointing to the way that we can act as covenant people of the Lord to be able to receive that same deliverance. And I wanted to point out a couple of linguistic details. So when I was going through this and I was trying to identify, like, what is the scholarship saying? What are some facts that we can take away from this idea of this weaving? Well, There's the mother as preserver. This is one idea. Deborah's viewed as this model of expansive mothering. Remember, she's not just a mother to her children, but she's a mother to the entire ancient world. And she's weaving both a physical and a spiritual fabric of the home
Right.
for the nation. And then you also have, I think, so some other things that were interesting. So the historical, there's this word, and I don't know how to say this, but it's YQTOL. So it's a yiktol, but it's like a really obscure linguistic detail. It's the use of this imperfect yiktol verb that it forms as a historical present. So it's like the history, but in the now. And it makes the reading of the battle feel like it's happening in real time for the listener, drawing you in, but even though it already happened. And it's another part of this like sophistication of her writing. Like she wants you to experience what they experience and put yourself in their shoes. That is what she intends for you to do with this song. And there's all of those parallelisms that we talked about. The lattice is really interesting too. So the word for that in Judges 5:28 that was just in the previous Tale of Two Mothers, the lattice is a rare word. It's eshnav, and they call this a hapax legomenon. So it's a word that appears only once or twice. So it's a very, very rare word. Whenever you see a rare word, it might be a little harder to identify the full scope of the symbolism there. But
Right.
what we can tell is that it depicts the mother of Sisera peering through this shaded, cool window. So she's static, she's captive, and she's contrasted with Deborah, who's active and arising. So think about the story of Lot's wife and remember how she became a pillar of salt and she became static and she would not move forward. So there's maybe like an ideological connection happening there. And it's all related to these women. So then if you'll go to the next slide, this is where you can kind of see a quick overview. I do have Gideon on here too, because it's going to compare these two women to
Right.
Gideon. And so there's this really cool kind of like, I don't know what you want to call it, but it ties back to the tribes. So through this like sharp poetic irony, Deborah actually rebukes tribes such as Reuben, Dan, and Asher for remaining comfortable among their flocks, ships, and coastlines, while the other tribes are risking their lives in battle for the community. And so like in contrast, you have Zebulun and Naphtali. They're praised for jeopardizing their lives unto death, demonstrating that the true covenant belonging requires an active faithfulness and sacrifice rather than this passive association. Even
Right.
Barak's hesitation becomes part of the theological message, as his reluctance to act without Deborah results in the honor of victory being transferred to Jael, foreshadowing later judges like Gideon, whose faith would also wrestle with fear and spiritual vulnerability. So you can see how there is some connection, and the scholars had made this connection that it seems like Deborah and Jael are actually intercessors because the men are falling short of doing
Yeah.
something that they need to do, and then the women are having to step in and make sure that this action continues, that this faithful action continues. So that was
Yeah.
kind of an interesting point. And then if you'll go over to the next one, I wanted to point out a divine feminine motif. So this is the slide that's going to do that. You talked about that earlier, Tim, but Deborah, she has this really unique combination, right? Because she's the judge, the prophetess, the covenant protector. She's like this national visionary, and she has political power. And people like militaries are listening to her, and it's during one of Israel's most unstable periods that we have recorded. And
Right.
so unlike other judges, she's portrayed as dispensing the legal judgment, the spiritual revelation, and leading the people toward this military deliverance. And this is all under the palm, and that's that symbol of wisdom, the stability, and the covenant guidance. And so it's like that motherly take, and that's why she's called this mother in Israel. So it shows
Right.
you that there's something about this idea of being a mother in Israel. If you were to expand it on the cosmic level, what you're seeing here, that this links to this divine feminine. And she's not just a wife, she's a woman of torches, a fiery woman, like we talked about with the linguistics of her name. And so Judges 4:4 is where you see that phrase, Ashet Lapidoth. And you can also look at the bee etymology. So Deborah's name literally translates to bee or wasp. And this is often viewed by scholars as a play on her dual nature, the sweetness of her prophetic wisdom, and the sting of her judgment against the Canaanite oppressors. So her name means bee, but then that title where they linked her to the wife of Lapidoth, if you look at other translations, they're suggesting this actually may be a title. It might not be saying she's the wife of Lapidoth. It might be talking about like a place. And anyway, so there's some linguistics happening there that gives you the idea of woman of torches, fiery woman, and the bee, the busy worker bee, all the things that the bee symbolizes. Right. And she's using these archaic verbal tenses. So this is that imperfect yiktol. And this is where, again, it's like she's saying, you think of yourself as me. So there is like a divine feminine motif. It's like she's writing in a way that she expects the reader, particularly I think the women in the story, to like identify with her and apply those traits to themselves, if that makes sense.
So I want to, because I want to sit with this for a moment, and we are winding down here a little bit. So I want to, because this just came to my mind. So the Apostle Paul, writing in 1 Corinthians 7, he's giving counsel with regards to marriage, right? In verse 12, and I'm reading out the NRSV UE, it says, "To the rest I say, I and not the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. And if any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce the husband. For the unbelieving husband," this is what really brought me to this passage. "For the unbelieving husband is made holy through his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy through the husband." I don't know why it says brother when he's talking about the husband. "Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. But if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so." And the reason why I think it brought me to this is that specifically with the wife who is residing with an unbelieving husband, she brings holiness into the home.
Yeah. I actually was just talking to a girl about this at church today because she's in that exact situation. And that is what I told her. That's what I told her. And I pointed to the scriptures and I pointed to the story of Deborah and several other women, because I was just like, look, you have an opportunity to be an intercessor.
Right.
So, well, do
on
what you can with that.
On that note, can you go back to the slide that had the blue and red threads?
I
think
it was number 28.
Yeah. Okay, so the thing that stuck out to me was this bottom paragraph. So it says, "Covenant women function symbolically as preservers of the covenant thread through the tapestry of biblical history, weaving heaven and earth together in times of crisis." Okay, so things that stuck out to me: covenant women, thread, tapestry, crisis. So
for those of you that don't remember your history very well, let me see if I can pull this up really quick.
Ooh, I bet this is going to be good.
In the Restoration, the sisters
on March 17th, 1842, restored what is called the Relief
Society as a sewing and charitable society to help workers building the Nabu temple and aiding the poor. One of the women, Sarah M. Kimball, proposed forming a constitution similar to other benevolent societies of the time. When they brought the idea to Joseph Smith, he said he had something better for them. Instead of merely a secular charitable association, he organized them, quote, "under the priesthood after the pattern of the priesthood." The wording here is just hyper symbolic. I'm not trying to say that Judges here is teaching the Relief Society, but it is touching on principles that women in their roles have had. And I would argue that the restoration of the Relief Society touches on these very symbolically with the exact wording that's being used here in that paragraph. And it moves over to, I just like that, under the priesthood after, under the priesthood after the pattern of the priesthood. Like, I just think that's super, super cool. And there's a lot that you can get.
Well, especially if you think of like a sewing pattern too.
Exactly.
Like the pattern that you're following. No, that's what I'm trying to say. And I hope that that's
coming through. Sessions,
Tim,
quilt party.
If you go to that last slide, number 31.
Well, so really quick on that. So again, if you're focusing too much on the physical aspect, this is something I said earlier in the thing. If you focus too much on the quilting parties, you're missing the spiritual aspect and the roles and the responsibilities that the divine feminine has in the latter days. Like, sure, do they do that? Sure, but there's a principle that's hidden there. If you have eyes to see and ears to hear, kind of a concept is what I'm going for, is like these things have reverberated throughout the dispensations, and it should be no surprise that the fullness of that has been restored in the latter days, where the Relief Society is the single largest female organization in the world. And I'm excited to see what its official headquarters looks like in Temple Square once that's all completed.
And remember
That's
that
gonna be really cool.
Emma, she was called to put together the hymn books, and we talked about this with Miriam, like the whole song thing. So
Yeah, the
you're
song
right.
of the song of Deborah or Emma Smith. Just saying.
Like all of that stuff, you're right. They are touching on this in the restoration, and that's what I mean by like when
Isn't
you
that
look at the
interesting?
restoration,
Yeah.
there's tons of parallels.
Well,
Testament stories
it's
being
interesting
restored.
because I got into a conversation with somebody on one of my TikTok lives today. I went live like 2 or 3 times. I can't remember. It's been a long day for me. But we were talking about the whole issue with polygamy, and I said, if you don't understand 19th century culture and society, you're not going to understand the women's suffrage movement, because it was because of women. In fact, I can't remember who it was. Maybe you know this, LD Scooby. It was the wife of somebody. He was writing something, he was doing something, but she says, "Don't forget about us women," when he's writing up something. I can't remember the exact quote, but I remember the reference that it's referring to.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that.
I'm not sure what you're talking about either, but I think that this is important. And when you read that first 50 years of Relief Society, there's all kinds of sermons where they're saying that exact same thing.
Right.
But if you want to go back to the beginning now, Tim, we can do like that little overview. I think it's only like 13 slides, and you can touch on the men's stories now. I took up like the whole time for the women this time.
Right. Oh, yeah. It's from Abigail Adams, who was married to John Adams, and it was in a letter date March 31st, 1776. Yeah. So she says, "Remember the ladies, and to be more generous and favorable to women than his ancestors had been." So,
yeah, there's a principle there.
Yeah. So, yeah, because women always had a hand in a lot of the movements. You know, the compassionate care, all those movements, they had hands. So this is what brings us to the whole point of Judges. In fact, of any scriptures that we study, is that the Lord raised up a deliverer. And I'm just going to kind of go through this because we are running short on time. So you've already touched on the cycle of apostasy, but here's just something different. This is just kind of feeds into the way of how apostasy works. Because Israel failed to remove wicked influences, they became entangled in sin, a pattern repeated multiple times after Joshua's death. So it begins with rebellion. Now, you know, when I say, what would you classify as the original sin, what would that be? What would you think that is referring to?
Are you referring to a scripture?
Well, I'm referring to the very first act of sin. What was the very first sin that was committed?
I think it was when Cain killed Abel.
Pride.
It was spiritual rebellion and pride. That is the original sin. Yes, that is the original sin, because you have the adversary, you have Satan, you have Lucifer, who got caught up in his own pride and he rebelled. So it always begins with pride, and it begins with spiritual rebelling against that. And then you have oppression, loss of divine protection. You have supplication, crying out in humility because we're brought low into humility. And then deliverance. God raises up a judge. So we are judged. We are seeking forgiveness. And then once we start doing good, we then fall back into the pattern of pride. That's why we refer to it as the pride cycle. And the snare of false gods. So Jehovah required singular devotion and covenants made at Sinai. The Lord declared that the Canaanite gods would be a snare unto them. Canaanite gods, Baal, Ashtoreth, promised fertility, rain, and success in warfare. Their worship was familiar: priests, altars, sacrifices, but led to abominations. This actually parallels the New Testament, because when you have the people of the way, they were contending and they were in radical opposition to a lot of these similar, the pantheon of the Roman gods. And so we kind of see this parallel that Christianity was birthed into a world of a pagan world that held beliefs to mystery cults, hero redeemer cults, and a lot of it was fidelity to the Roman Empire. And it was very radical to declare one Lord, one faith, one baptism, and one truth, because that not only was that radical, it was downright treason to hold to that. And so this is how we see these parallels ring out. And there's a whole different conversation we can have on the nature of Esther, because biblical scholarship shows that she actually was part of the divine council and consort of the divine council there with Elohim, and then later collapsed into Yahweh as Yahweh's consort. And then we move into what you talked about, Deborah and Barak, prophetic leadership and courage. You touched on that. Is not the Lord gone out before thee? Judges 4:14. So Deborah is the only female judge mentioned in the Old Testament. A prophetess is a woman who enjoys the spirit of revelation. And, we see her operate in that role as a prophetess, but we also see prophetesses operating in the role in the New Testament, even under the leadership of the apostles. And so that I think that's very interesting that we kind of don't really understand or grasp. So it'd be a good, interesting study to go down that
Maybe
rabbit hole.
when we get to New Testament, we can go back and look at, do the same thing, kind of find that thread.
Right. So here we have Gideon. Gideon tore down the altar of Baal, earning the name Jeroboam. Let Baal contend. The Lord intentionally reduced his army to just 300 men to prove the victory came from God, not man. What I find fascinating about the story with Gideon was that they didn't actually go to war. They did not actually engage in combat. They actually shouted. 300 men shouting so loud that it put fear in the opposing army, that it caused the opposing army to turn back. And they didn't have to get into physical combat.
Mormon Battalion. Nauvoo Legion.
The parallels are endless, guys.
They're there. We don't have to actually fight.
And so we have born with the promise to begin to deliver.
It was
Israel.
the water. It was the cosmic elements too in that story.
Yes, it was.
So we have Samson, who grew. He looked more to the world's temptations than to God's direction. Repeated the scriptures, used the phrase, and he went down as they tell of Samson's journeys, actions, and choice. This is from Sister Ann M. Dibb. So we have that. And then we have the profile of deliverance. So we have the threat of the Canaanites. We have the prophetesses of Deborah. And we have the palm and the sword that you talked about. And the divine lesson is that faith inspires others to action. Then you have the reluctant warrior, Gideon. He's the Midianites are the threat. Trumpet and torch is the symbol, and trusting God's unlikely methods. And then we have the consecrated strongman, Samson. The threat were the Philistines. His covenant was tied to uncut hair and pillars. So we are to stay true to sacred covenants for that. So this is the profile of deliverance. And then
and you know what else too is in there? So just to go on with the descend to ascend, there's actually a phrase in there, guys, when you're reading it, just look for and he went down. Because like when you're reading, like pick that up, because that's where you're going to see that theme.
That seems too simple and obvious, though. There must be more.
Right. And we have anatomy of a covenant, the Nazarite vow. So Samson's hair was not magical. It was a physical symbol of a spiritual covenant. God was the source of Samson's strength. The vow, we are to abstain from grapes, wine, avoid dead bodies, do not cut hair. And then you have the Spirit of the Lord for that.
Section 89.
And what that actually reminds me of how critics like to claim, oh, you wear those magic it's not, they're not magic. They're just a reminder and symbolic of our covenants. And that's how I correlate that with this. And then we have the Lord empowers imperfect people. The deliverers and judges were flawed. Gideon built a golden ephod that became an idol. Samson was driven by selfish desires, yet God still used him to deliver his people. The earthly judges provided temporary physical relief, pointing to our need for a perfect eternal deliverer. The thing I take away with this is that God's going to use people with where they're at. He's going to call us into those things that he wants us to accomplish. And he's not asking us to come into it completely perfect and coming into it with full understanding. What he's expecting us to do is step into those callings and then continue to seek after him so we can continue to receive the revelation to do what he's called us to do, to be stewards over that particular calling. And so he's going to use us. We are imperfect. And we have to understand that when we come into that relationship, we're coming into it as imperfect people. We come into it in chaos. Eventually, if we're growing in our faith and maturing, then we grow in perfection. We grow into spiritual perfection, where we start experiencing a sense of completeness and wholeness because of our Heavenly Father, because of Jesus Christ. And then we have the covenant confidence. Those who gain genuine confidence in the covenants made in the house of the Lord through Jesus Christ possess one of the most powerful forces that we can access in this life. It empowers us to overcome the seeds of doubt and despair. Elder Ulysses Soares, is that how you pronounce his first name? I
I
have a
think
hard
it's
time pronouncing
Ulysses Suarez.
Ulysses. Okay.
Elder Suarez.
Elder Suarez, yes. Elder Suarez, yes.
There you go.
But this is what it points to. Christ is the ultimate deliverer. So as the world speaks less of Jesus Christ, we need to be speaking more of him. Elder Neil Anderson, because he is the anchor of our souls. He alone breaks the cycle of our sins, and it's something that's permanent through his infinite atonement. So really, this is what our study always points to, is the reality of coming to know who Jesus Christ is, that he delivers us from our pains. He delivers us from our sufferings. He delivers us from grief and loss, our addictions, our everything. We just have to put our faith and trust in him and seek him continually and walk along that path. So where's the Lord raising up deliverance in my own life? So Deborah, who am I inspiring to have faith in the Lord? Gideon, where is God asking me to trust his unlikely methods? And then Samson, how am I protecting the spiritual strength of my covenants? So I think those are three important questions we ought to be asking ourselves as it relates to this week's study, to keep them forefront in your mind, and just kind of reflect on that. It's like, who am I inspiring to have faith in the Lord? How can I strengthen other people in their testimony and their faith? And then where's God asking me to trust his unlikely methods? And then how am I protecting the spiritual strength of my covenants? And I think those are some really good, important questions. And I like this, D&C 115, verse 5. Arise and shine forth, that thy light may be a standard for the nations.
Yeah, and just to draw another Doctrine and Covenants parallel, so in this whole Judges story, there's been this theme where, remember when it said, "Is not the Lord gone out before thee?" Well, in Doctrine and Covenants, section 84, which is all about the oath and covenant of the priesthood, in verses 87 to 88, you get that same idea, and it says, "Go before your face and have his spirit in your hearts." Like, it uses this
Right.
same concept and drawing on those like same kind of phrases and ideas. And you also see that in Second Nephi, right? Because there's that idea of, we talk of Christ, we preach of Christ. And so it's like this idea that you're turning to the Lord, and that, I don't know, it's in our restoration scriptures too, is what I'm
Right.
saying. Like these Old Testament concepts, like we are totally a restoration of the Old and the New Testament covenant combined.
Right. So this ties into what I've been doing because I've been going through. I have a book called A.W. Tozer's The Set of the Cell. It's a collection of all of his messages. They're very short messages, and it's titled The Set of the Cell. And I've been going through it and doing these devotionals on how we can set the sail of our recovery and sobriety. And it just kind of fits within this, that when we set the sail to true north, to who Jesus Christ is, he's going to fill the sail so that we can continue to move towards the other side of where he's wanting us to go. But we're going to still face the storms. We're still going to, and one of the most powerful messages that I heard was with regards to, it's in Mark chapter 4, and Christ sends the disciples to go to the other side, and that he was going to meet them there. And it's only in the Gospel of Mark, because then they see him. He's walking, and he sees them struggling, and it even says he intended to go past them, because the plan was to meet them on the other side. And so he intended to go past them. And it really put a different perspective on how we view Christ in relationship to our own struggles. We're straining in our difficulties. We're straining in our lives. We're straining with our fears, our doubts. We may be straining with our questions about the church, and he sees us, and he does stop.
In Judges 2:18, it uses that phrase that the Lord was moved to pity for his people.
Right. But he does stop, and he gets in the boat, and he commands the wind to cease, and he calls them out for their lack of faith.
Yeah, and I think another connection that was made in this lesson was Matthew 11:28, where the Savior gives that personal invitation, "Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." And if you follow that concept of rest throughout the scriptures, it goes all the way back to the beginning. And remember Noah, his name meant peace and rest, and there is a connection to the scarlet thread in rest.
Nice. All right. So any final thoughts, Scoob? Any reflective thoughts? Any personal takeaways and applications?
Yeah, so I'll be posting this on my channel, but I had a conversation with this lady that she came up to somebody else's panel and was asking questions about the temple, and every question was, how weird is it that you guys do this and that in the temple, and you wear this and say this, and very, very specific questions. So it was like, you're clearly not asking these questions for understanding. You're asking them as like some kind of a weird gotcha that, look at the Latter-day Saints, doing weird stuff. And in the conversation, I basically just went, hey, really quick, did you graduate high school or college? And she goes, high school. Yeah. I said, did you wear anything specific on that day? She goes, oh, well, yeah, like the cap and gown and stuff. I went, oh, okay. Why do you do that? She goes, I don't know, actually. And I went, when you were graduating, did you move the tassel thingy from one side of your cap to the other side, symbolically of something like new beginnings or something like that? And she goes, yeah, I guess I hadn't really thought about that. I went, okay, are you married? She goes, yeah. I went, what did you wear to that? And she goes, well, I mean, my ring and my dress. I went, oh, why'd you do that? She goes, oh, well, it's kind of just what you do. And I went, is it possible that the ring that you're wearing means something symbolically in the ceremony you're about to participate in? And she goes, well, yeah, I guess I just hadn't really thought about it. And I went, so it sounds like you do just as many ceremonies as we do now, doesn't it? And so we had this kind of interesting back and forth and stuff of just, our society has tons of symbolic ceremonies that we do.
Right.
And I would argue, so we talked about Deborah a lot in her roles, both liturgically and legalistically, as a prophetess and as well as a leader within Israel at the time. You have Samson, who is a Nazarite, who didn't really live up to his covenants all the way. And it's one of those kind of, it's kind of a cautionary tale in that sense. But when you really think about it, we have nothing to be ashamed of in the gospel. I know a lot of people like to try to poke fun and say magical underwear, this and that, but what's interesting is in the April 2024 General Conference, there's a talk that's in the Come Follow Me from President Dallin H. Oaks called Covenants and Responsibilities. And he actually walks through basically the argument that I kind of just went through with that person. But it says, distinctive clothing or name tags are intended to signify the wearer is under covenant and therefore has a duty to teach and serve and should be supported in that service. A related purpose is to remind the wearers of their covenant responsibilities. There is no magic in their distinctive clothing or symbols, only a needed reminder of the special responsibilities the wearers have assumed. This is also true of the symbols of the engagement and wedding rings and their role in giving notice to observers or reminding wearers of covenant responsibilities. I really just love, like, I mean, we've been really harping on the scarlet thread, but it's a great thread to be tugging on because it teaches us about those covenant responsibilities that Israel often forgot.
Right.
Yeah, often forgot. And I think that is so hyper important for us because we have a friend that has recently left the church again. And I was just talking with them the other day, and they were making this argument online that, you know, if you have faith, you should be baptized. And I said, well, perhaps if you're not willing to live up to the covenant associated with that ordinance, perhaps it would be appropriate to wait a second until you actually are willing to live up to those responsibilities that come with that covenant. Mm-hmm. And they tried to argue, well, no, it's just an outward expression of an inward commitment, which is something that I think that members actually say quite a bit with the garment. And to an extent, I agree. But what I said was, but baptism specifically is entering into the covenant. Colossians and Galatians specifically mention it as the new circumcision, which the new circumcision is repeated in the Old Testament over and over and over. It's how you enter the covenant. And it is a symbol to show that you have done that, both to yourself and to those that are observing you. And I would argue that that's where our garments and our wedding rings and things like that come into play. Of we're not just saying that we have faith in Christ, with our mouths with no heart behind it. We're actually we're actually covenanting with the God of Israel, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and he hasn't changed. The people that he made covenants with changed, and therefore needed restorations and periods of restorations that we see throughout. I would even argue within the book of Judges itself are multiple restoration-like events where Israel's going off course and they need to be corrected and restored back to the original covenant that they made with the God of Israel. So I just wanted to a lot of the things that I've said tonight, I'm not trying to say the Relief Society is there present in the Old Testament. Like our garments are there. I actually think garments are, but these principles are being taught.
Linen, guys. It's the linen.
The linen, yes.
the principles are being reiterated, and we are watching how an ancient Israelite would have understood those principles. And then how in the New Testament, how the apostles would have understood it. And now we are living in the restoration and in 2026, where those principles are still the same. It's the new and everlasting covenant. And just because it looks slightly different in our context than it does in the Old Testament does not diminish the fact that that concept and that principle existed in those times. They are hyper important. And we see that because it keeps getting reiterated throughout all the dispensations. So that was my kind of big takeaway.
Well, that's why you have to follow the thread. Like you said, it's like it started out as this white thread and you see the coats of skins in Eden, and it's going to end up, you guys, with the second coming and a millennial reign of Jesus Christ. So there will be an ultimate, like everything you're doing in the temple is preparatory for something that you will eventually do for real.
Right.
All right, folks, I think that is about it. That's good discussion. This is not your typical Sunday school discussion. This is great to have.
Did you like it? If you did, hit that like button, leave us a comment, and let us know what you like so we know what to deliver.
Yes. Hit that like, share, and subscribe on our channels. We do this every Sunday, 7:30 p.m. Pacific time, 8:30 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. And it's always a blessing to just come learn and get into the scriptures and draw closer to Christ and to our Heavenly Father. because we're all pressing forward with steadfast faith through him. Have a good night. Be blessed. Be inspired.